Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week let's take a look at some absolutely killer pieces of gear that I think you may have missed. So a few days ago, I was taking a look back through a couple of older episodes of Friday Fretworks and came to the conclusion that over the last few years, I've made so many videos that, as such, there are a couple of pieces of gear which I've highlighted, which I still think are flying under the radar, or criminally underrated, you could say. I know it's a very common criticism of people like myself that we drive up the prices on gear, whether it's as a consequence of shining a light on otherwise forgotten gems, or simply through bleating on about things long enough until people feel as though they can kind of price them a little bit higher. So as much as this type of video does draw a risk of inspiring the ire of certain factions of the guitar community, I guess I consider this a risk worth taking if ultimately I can tip you off to a few pieces of gear which I think you may have missed. First up, and speaking of bleating on about things, this is a piece of gear which I've definitely been guilty of highlighting on more than one occasion in the past, is of course the Fender Pro Reverb. The irony in all this being that I've not actually been using the Pro Reverb, at least live, for the last couple of months, pretty much since I got my Super Reverb. But prior to that, this was my sole amp for quite a while actually, pretty much from the inception of Cardinal Black. It was the only amp I used at our first ever show at Cardiff Castle, and then for the subsequent tours, both with Miles Kennedy, the Struts, and Peter Frampton. It was the main amp along with the Victory Copper Deluxe. It did have a different speaker in there at some point. It was a Jensen something or other if memory serves, which unfortunately blew up when I was recording the debut Cardinal Black album. But in putting the original neodymium speaker back in there, it just reaffirmed my initial thoughts on this amp. It is an absolutely killer bit of gear. Now, it's worth pointing out the Fender have taken a little bit of creative license in calling it a Pro Reverb. Pro Reverbs, at least typically historically, of course, having two sets of inputs and two 12-inch speakers, much like my 68, 69 model and my mate Ed's 65 model, which I made a video comparing and contrasting earlier in the year. I'll link to that above. The originals were 40 watts, much like the reissue, but of course the reissue having only a single 12-inch speaker. But as much as this isn't necessarily true to the original, I would say it's a risk having worth taking. This is an amp that punches well above its weight, both figuratively and literally. Now, there's a million and one clips of me using this in isolation on Friday Fretworks, so I thought it'd be cool to use it in a band context for this next clip. So I've taken the recording of Tell Me How It Feels from the Royal Albert Hall with Peter Frampton, so you can hear it first in context, and then I'm going to bump the level of the individual recording of the Pro Reverb, kick it above the mix of the band and bring the band right down so you can hear it in context and in part isolation, I guess. Sounds a little bit like this. Next up, we have a pedal which only narrowly missed the cut when it came to my new pedal board, but to be honest, may well find its way on there in coming months. It is of course the Victory Copper V1. It's a collaboration between Victory and Thorpe Effects, and you can kind of think of it as a condensed version of the Victory Copper Deluxe, Victory's kind of idealised take on perfect AC30, an amp not only that I've had a hell of a lot of experience with, but as I mentioned earlier, toured pretty extensively with, so I know this amp and consequently this pedal inside out. Now, as I mentioned, it didn't actually make the cut for my pedal board. The pedal I went with in the end was, of course, the Origin Revival Drive Compact, just because we're in kind of writing and pre-production for our second album at the moment, so having that little bit of extra versatility, kind of functionality was particularly useful to me. But when it comes to actually nailing the sound of a Vox AC30 and really kind of, bringing up that heart and soul of that amp that I know so well, there's really nothing better. It really absolutely nails that sound without having to go so far as to actually getting a Vox style amp. If you're looking for Vox vibes, honestly, you could do a hell of a lot worse than the V1. Next up, it's not so much a piece of gear so much as a little subtle trick or a modification that I featured in a video a few years ago, and that is running your Les Paul or any similar kind of two-pickup guitar for that matter out of phase. Now, of course, when it comes to out of phase, the player which is arguably most synonymous with that nasal hollow quack is of course Peter Green, but there were any number of players who put it to incredible use, whether it's T-Bone Walker, Jimmy Page, Albert King or Hubert Sumlin, the list goes on. But what is out of phase? Now, a Les Paul, when it's in its middle position and wired correctly with both pickups active, is running in parallel, which of course means you not only have two independent volume controls for each pickup, but the signals or the waveforms generated by each pickup are in phase. They peak and they trough at the same time. Now, when it's out of phase, as you can probably guess, it's the opposite. So as one peaks, the other troughs, which give you that signature kind of nasal hollow quack of the sound of two pickups being out of phase with one another. Now, there's two ways of achieving this. The first is electronically, simply reverse the hot and the cold wires coming from the pickup. The advantage of this being that you can kind of assign that to a switch or a push-pull pot, so you can easily turn it on and off. The second way, and arguably the more traditional, is to reverse the phase magnetically. Now, to do this, you're going to have to remove the bar magnet from one of the pickups, switch it around 180 degrees, thus reversing its magnetic polarity relative to the coil. Push it back in, tighten the screws, and hey presto, your middle position is going to be out of phase, at least when both of your pickups are at full on each of their respective volume pots. The beauty of this being that if you even very slightly roll back one of those volumes, you're going to significantly reduce that out of phase sound because you're fundamentally changing the phase relationship between the two pickups. Yes, it is a weird sound, admittedly, but if you are specifically looking to emulate that Peter Green tone or simply looking to get something different out of your Les Paul or two-pickup guitar, it's definitely worth experimenting with. Next up, again, it's not so much a piece of gear so much as an appointment or a feature on certain guitars that it came equipped with. We are, of course, talking about the Veritone circuit by Gibson. Now, I've made a specific video on the Veritone in the past, outlining its history and its kind of technical sort of side and which guitars it was featured on. I'll link to that above. But for those uninitiated, you can essentially think of the Veritone circuit as a notch filter, removing preset slices from your mid-range, increasingly so the higher you go on that rotary dial. Now, there are certain similarities in the out-of-phase sound, but they are fundamentally different. It's worth pointing out in that the higher you go, the more increasingly nasal and hollow it becomes, up to the point where position 6, the highest position on that rotary switch, is almost akin to the sound of a transistor radio, really thin and really hollow. Now, the Veritone circuit was originally featured on Gibson's top-of-the-line semi-hollow bodies, namely the ES345 and the ES355. It was a way of differentiating it from the humble 335, but when Gibson's own website actually describes it, or denigrates it, I could say, as a period feature, it's surprising to see that it's survived this long. Its survival pretty much can be exclusively attributed to two people, or two kings, Freddie and BB. And to be honest, when I got my 355, my Shinichi Ubukata ES355 a few years ago, it did briefly cross my mind as to whether I should just take it out of the guitar entirely. Was I really going to have any use for it? But in hindsight, needless to say, I'm very glad I didn't. When it came to record in January, I came close, Cardinal Black's album, specifically one track called On My Own. Got about a third of the way through the track before I actually realised that I had engaged position 1, or kind of notch number 2, on the Veritone circuit, which in a weird way defined the sound of that track. It is a very unique, very distinctive sound, which, as I said, has come to define the sound of that song going forward. You can hear it on this next recording I'm going to play you, but as I said, this is a somewhat antiquated piece of technology, I guess, but very much has its use. I'm not sure I'd go out of my way to fit it or retrofit it to a guitar which doesn't come equipped with one, but if you have got a Gibson with a Veritone circuit, don't overlook it. There are some really cool tones you can get out of it. Sounds a little bit like this. And last, but by no means least, again, it's a piece of gear that I guess I've been a fairly vocal proponent of over the last few years, even going so far as to buy an original example, albeit highly modified, from 1956, is of course the Fender Duo-Sonic. Now, initially introduced as a student model, but thankfully a guitar that has survived all this time, it is a total gem, and in my humble opinion, definitely still flies under the radar. Now, if you're looking to buy a new example, you're going to be looking at around about the £600 mark or $750, but in the second-hand market currently, there's a few great examples going for quite considerably sub £400, and honestly, for that kind of money, it really is a no-brainer. They are such a unique, cool, inspiring guitar. That scale length of 24 inches, a worthwhile concession, it's worth pointing out on Fender's part, with the original having been 22.5. It's a very cool guitar, my original 56, but it does kind of feel like playing a ukulele. 24 just gives it a little bit more stability, and as I said, it really does inspire you to play differently. It has a sound and a feel all its own. I guess ultimately, because it's not a Strat, or because it's not a Tele or a true offset like a Mustang or a Jazzmaster, they've kind of fallen in between the cracks, and I kind of feel like they're homeless to a degree when it comes to a place within Fender's lineup. It's worth mentioning this is actually the second iteration or the second reissue of the Duo-Sonic that Fender have done, so it is by no means, to any extent, a core part or a permanent part of their lineup. So if you are thinking of getting on one, don't sleep to the point where they are discontinued, and subsequently the second-hand value goes to the roof. They really are an incredible little guitar for the money. I'm going to play you out on one now as ever, but thank you very much for watching. I'm Chris Buck, this is Friday Fretworks. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers guys, see you soon.